to Christoph for inviting me to be part of this wonderful festival, which has been running for a few years now and is just so beautifully curated as a sort of celebration of everything that's unfolding in the mindfulness field. So what I would like to do in the next little while that we're all together, by the way, I'm Willem Kuyken, so I'm a mindfulness researcher and teacher in Oxford, is to talk to you a little bit about what I see as some of the challenges that we've been working on and that we have going forwards. And then maybe just say something about the sort of success of our work to date, which will be hopefully just the first 5 minutes or so of our work, of the time we've got. And then I want to sort of shift gear and talk about where I see some of the challenges and where I see maybe what we as a mindfulness community, in whatever form or shape that takes, seem to be moving. But just before we start there, maybe just inviting everybody just to come into your body and have a sense of really just taking your awareness from wherever it was to internally in your body. And just if it's necessary and it feels helpful, to shift the body so it has a sense of feeling really awake, really present, really kind of dignified. And I'm going to suggest maybe just the idea of a tree, so that your feet in contact with the ground are like the root system. And that your torso is kind of like the trunk. Your hands and arms are kind of like the branches. The crown of your head is kind of like an apex of this tree. And if it's helpful, just bring to mind a tree that you know. So you have this sense of being rooted, like the trunk and the branches of a tree, really having a strength, but also a flexibility. And I want to just drop a question into the practice. I don't want you necessarily to, and there's going to be no requirement to call out anything, but just to drop this question into the practice. For you, to answer the question of this talk, what does a life well lived mean? For you personally, what does a life well lived mean? And it's quite easy to get kind of carried away with sort of quite abstract ideas. See if you can make it really real in terms of how you lead, how you engage this moment, this day, this week. Because as Annie Dillard said, that is our life. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. So not far from here, I was hiking a couple of years ago, just after the pandemic, and I took my lunch in a graveyard. And I was just sitting there by this gravestone and having my lunch, and it was a really simple gravestone, and it said on it a woman's name. I think it had the dates, and then just the phrase, a life well lived. And I thought, I'd like my gravestone to say that, but first I have to get to a point where I can actually feel like I can say it. So I spent the rest of the walk thinking about what that looked like for me, and as I sort of travelled around post-pandemic, sort of giving talks and workshops around sort of findings from a big study that we completed, but also a book that I've been working on, I asked that question of hundreds of people. And here's some of the things that they said. Just see if it resonates with some of the things that maybe came up for you in the practice just now. It's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting, that question. So I'll come back to that. And I want to just very briefly talk about our work to date. And by our, I mean the sort of a large number of people, some of whom are here in the room today, who have been working on a particular challenge, which is a challenge that I've spent my career working on, which is depression. About 1 million people in the world alive today will be touched by depression directly at some point in their lifetime. That's a lot of people, 1 billion people. Has tremendous costs and morbidity. And I want to just very briefly touch on the work we've done, because I think it's worth celebrating, not because I want to look back, but because I think it's worth celebrating. Because it's an example of what we in the mindfulness community, and it's not the only, there are many examples, can do really well. We can go, what's sometimes called sort of with translational science, we can articulate a problem, in this case, depression. We can think, how does our understanding of depression potentially respond to an intervention like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in this case? And then to move beyond it being an idea into reality, can we turn that into systematically answering the question, is this effective? And is it cost effective? And we've done that. All of that work's been done. So Mark, Zindel and John developed mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression. There have been at least 15 randomized controlled trials with ever more sort of nuanced ways of asking this question. So just to give you 2 recent examples so you have a sense of being perhaps a little bit updated. But Clara Strauss is in the latest trial with Robert Marks, I think, is here as well, demonstrated that a low-intensity version of this intervention, delivered in frontline NHS services, can be as cost-effective and perhaps slightly more effective than a low-intensity CBT intervention. That's amazing. Basically, that means give people the book, The Mindful Way Through Depression, give them a few sessions with a what's called a PWP, or used to be called a PWP, psychological wellbeing practitioner, and that can actually be a really cost-effective way of helping people with depression. Just recently, in NHS services, only 50% of people show recovery rates at the end of mainstream treatments. Latest trial, not yet published, again, Clara Strauss, Thorsten Barnhofer and others, have shown if you give those people MBCT, with massive cost effectiveness, you get them leaving the service actually close to wellness. So this is a tremendous success story, but it's not a complete success story in any sense of the word, because, yes, in England, I should be able to go to my primary care service and say, can I get MBCT? And then I should be able to sign up for a class quite soon. And that's still a far way from reality for all sorts of complex reasons. And in other countries, it's just not even, there aren't even trained people. So there's a huge gap between this tremendous success story and where we'd like to go. So that's the past. What about where we are and where we're going? So a couple of kind of quite challenging things about where we are and where we're going. But I think really good challenging things. This is a participant in a trial of mine from 2015 who I kept in touch with, and he said a few really interesting things, which is part of the challenge and the opportunity. He said, after the class, I was able to come off my medication, I was able to use the mindfulness practice to stay well, but I had another relapse, and I went back on the medication. That's interesting, right? So it's not a panacea, he's not cured, he's telling us that actually he still got depressed again and he had to go back on medication. And he said, you know what, the mindfulness ended up being not so much about my depression, but about my relationship with my teenage kids, and about my marriage, and my health, because he developed bone cancer. So what he was saying was that these were lifelong skills that he could take into the rest of his life. And he said, Willem, you know what, all that body scans, the sitting practices, I don't really do it anymore. Which is, I was like, no, because I was trained in the days, you've got to do 40 minutes of practice and blah, blah, blah. Don't really do it anymore. So that's quite interesting, it's quite challenging, right? And then the other thing which I want to just say as a kind of, in a way, challenge, if you like, is, so we've got these kind of treatments, like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, cognitive behavioral therapy and medication and so on. But the reality is most mental health problems first arise in adolescence or early adulthood. So we just heard a really kind of inspiring talk, or at least I did just before lunch. How do we work with young people? And how do we work with young people potentially in the developmental window before they ever have mental health problems? And with this recognition, this is data from a large study that we did over the last 8 years, about 1 in 3 young people are reporting significant mental health challenges of one form or another. That's just totally unacceptable. 1 in 3 are reporting significant mental health challenges of one form or another. And I'll just say this because I don't know why, but it's really in my mind. I was last Sunday with my sister staying in a hotel in Plymouth, and the breakfast hall was extraordinary. It was like being in World War III. There were young children who were just completely out of control. And, you know, they were running around the breakfast hall, they were throwing food on the floor, nobody was supervising them. And it just had this sort of frantic and quite unsettling quality to it. And I thought, what are these kids trying to say? I mean, why are they so dysregulated? And why are their parents unable to respond to that in some way? What's happening for those parents? What's happening for those children? And I was looking at this boy, and you could see me looking at him, and he was like... And it was interesting. It's just really interesting. That's his lived reality. That boy is going to go into primary. He wasn't even at primary school age. I think he was 3 or 4. He's going to go in, and a primary school teacher's going to have to deal with him. And something's happening in his life. And I think this is the challenge that I think we're facing. And Albert Einstein, you know, I'm a scientist and I love science. But what I love about Albert Einstein is because he was a scientist, but he was also a tremendous humanist. And he was also an independent thinker. He didn't say what people expected him to say. Yeah? Sometimes that's quite surprising things. So when people were talking to him, he was a pacifist as well. After the development of the atomic bomb, people said, you know, Einstein, this has been developed now, and how do we change the trajectory away from nuclear proliferation? This was after the Second World War. And he said the kind of thinking that has got us into this situation isn't the kind of thinking that's going to get it out of this situation. And I'd like to suggest to you that we collectively, as a mindfulness community, need to be rethinking and reframing how we move forwards. So we did a large-scale study, and I won't go into it because it's not the place to go into it. But it had surprising findings, which led me and the team to look at the data in novel and interesting ways. And so we had just the opportunity through COVID to ask this question: what helped young people navigate COVID? And we had tons of data, huge data set, fantastic statistical team, really high quality data. And it was 3 different variables, which weren't the variables that we were looking for or hunting for. The first was the quality of their home environment. If kids felt like it was a safe place to be, that they could talk to their parents, that there was a loving home environment, that was predictive of doing well through the COVID pandemic. The second was the culture of the school that they were in. A school where they felt there was a sense of psychological safety, where teachers were approachable and accessible. And there were kind of clear anti-bullying campaigns. Again, it kind of makes complete logical sense, right? And then the third variable was, peer relationships. Isn't that interesting? That the data was telling us this tripartite set of factors. If we can get home environment right, school environment right, and support young people in their peer relationships, that could be a massively helpful thing to do for young people's mental health. So how do we as a mindfulness community respond to that? And I'd like to suggest a few things. A lot of the critique, not a lot, a critique of the mindfulness field has been, oh, you guys are doing secular mindfulness, where's the ethics? Where are the values? And in the talk before lunch, somebody was, I don't want to name particular presenters, but was talking about the need for connection with values and the importance of reconnection for values at lots of different levels. This was in relation to children and schools and so on. Because of course that little boy, I can't imagine my 4-year-old daughters doing that to a stranger in a restaurant. But for him this was completely normal. It was absolutely fine. And at some level it is fine. I'm not scared of a 4-year-old boy. But can we at some level reimagine how, as mindfulness teachers, we think about values in the work that we do? And Ruth Bayer, who's here, has written extensively about that. She said, she comes at it interestingly from the point of view of professional values. If you're working in schools, you're probably working as a teacher, you've got a set of values that you draw on there. But actually in terms of mindfulness teaching, quite a few of the organisations around mindfulness have set some really clear and I think compelling values that can act as a sort of compass in our work. Not explicitly in the sense of driving this down people's throats, but more in a sense of actually just helping people reconnect with their own personal values, which for many people they haven't inquired into, or a sense of maybe collective values in a workplace or in a school or wherever it might be. I think the second and really key thing we need to be thinking about doing is meeting people where they are. So when Di says to me, I don't really have mindfulness as an integrated part of my life anymore. Instead of me getting into a parental teachery role and going, no, Di, if you don't get on the cushion for 40 minutes every day, mate, you're gonna relapse again. That was his lived reality. And again, with young children, it's really difficult to get children to meditate. In the big study I described, we asked young people following a 10-week mindfulness training what proportion of them had done all of the mindfulness training that we asked them to do. Yeah, those of you who've got parents or teachers, again, why did you even ask that question? I can tell you the answer. They didn't do the mindfulness practice. They just didn't do the mindfulness practice. So let's meet children where they are. How can we support children to become mindful, which is without a doubt a good thing for them to have a sense of focus and self-regulation, but in a way that actually supports them to do that. And of course the whole issue of diversity, inclusion, equality, equity comes into play here. And I think the community, I think there's a workshop right now, but we're getting much more thoughtful, and we've got a long way to go. The recent conference in Bangor I thought was quite excellent on this. Meeting people not where we want them to be, but where they actually are. Sarah Silverton and I were talking before lunch about this, and how in a way that's not that difficult to do, but maybe we've got a little way to go with that. The second thing I would like to just say is where our work is going, is this idea of a kind of a population approach. So with MBCT for depression, but also MBCT for sort of pain and many other applications, we're thinking about people on one end of the curve, people who are struggling. Even with young people, we're maybe thinking about those 1/3 who've got mental health problems. But if you think about heart health, 50 years ago, most of the impetus in healthcare systems around heart health was around people post-heart attack, doing bypass surgery, stents, statins, cardiac rehab, those sorts of things. I would say the majority of our impetus around heart health nowadays is as a population health approach. Improving diet, improving exercise, improving the factors that we know drive positive heart health. And I think in 50 years we've seen that change. How can we do the same thing with mindfulness? How can we think about that as a sort of population level? What kind of what kinds of things can we support people to learn that will help not just those who are struggling with depression, but also those who are languishing, those who are maybe well and would like to thrive, and support those in thriving. And I think that's very much where we're beginning to go. And then the final thing I want to just say here, and this is a piece of work that is being led by Shannon Maloney in my group as part of a larger NIHR project, which is starting to reframe what it means to flourish. So flourishing, when people think about flourishing, they often think about an individual flourishing. But what we're arguing is it's probably if we think about the world and the sustainable development in the world and ecosystems and this idea of a tree as well, it's people don't flourish in isolation from the groups that they are a part of. So I saw that with the children. What 3 factors predict children's doing well through a stressor like the pandemic? Whether they felt part of a home, a school, and a peer group. But bigger than that, and I haven't really spent time in Manchester, but I'm really amazed by how many wonderful green spaces there are here. You know, there seems to be a real sense of actually trying, even within the city, to connect people with some green spaces, and to think about planetary health being part of collective health and being part of individual health as well. I won't belabor that because it's not the main part of what I want to talk about today. So, this is quite abstract. How can we make it a bit more real? And I think there are many ways we can make it a bit more real. But where I want to just start is some work that I did with my colleague and friend, Christina Feldman, where I came as a sort of psychological scientist, and she came as a very experienced Dharma teacher. And we started to teach, and then when we went separate ways, I moved to Oxford, and she is living in Totnes in Devon. We decided to write this book, which is a sort of book which is trying to bring the very best of psychological science, the very best of Buddhist psychology, to try and essentially help us understand and explain how the human mind and the human body can create both suffering, but create also joy. And I'll just say one other thing at this point, which is, I think, one of the other kind of misunderstandings about mindfulness, which I think is beginning to change, which is something that Thich Nhat Hanh has been saying since bringing it over from Vietnam for decades, the late Thich Nhat Hanh, is that the cultivation of a changed relationship to our body and mind is always going to be the ground from which we have a relationship with other people. So he called it interbeing. So that kind of work that we do with understanding our own body and mind is the very ground from which we stand in relationship to other people, but also potentially the planet. So that inner and outer thing, I think, is something that we need to be thinking a lot more about. And we have, I think, done some really super work on trying to, and there's loads of examples just chatting to people over the course of the day, of people doing this work, of beginning to think about, if I want to take mindfulness, which I know is helpful for me, and the evidence base is pretty compelling that there is strong relationships between mindfulness and all sorts of positive outcomes, how can I adapt that to schools, to prisons, to children, to older adults, to people with chronic fatigue, with fame? We have a way of thinking about that, and again, today is not the place to go into that. But what I want to talk about in the last part of the time together is a particular curriculum and approach that we've been developing, which is one of a family of many different approaches, but is trying to draw on what I see as some of the real challenges, and I guess what people are saying that they need more of. So I'm going to just call this mindfulness for life for the moment, because it's just as a placeholder. But if we are serious about a population health approach, and we're serious about helping people who are currently well and people who are also potentially thriving and wanting to continue to thrive, we need to think not just about working with suffering, but also with, if you like, the positive valence system. And actually, in terms of the architecture of the body and the mind, they're no different. The mind that processes sensory experience, that turns that into understanding, that turns that into the ground for responsiveness, that isn't a different structure and set of processes for pain as it is for appreciation or joy. So it's in a sense the same kind of system. So I want to just kind of outline three pieces to this. So the first bit I've spoken about, which is trying to draw on the very best of ancient wisdom and the very best of modern psychology, and that's the work that Christina Feldman and I did. And what we've just finished, and it's just been published in the States, going to be published here as well, is a book called Mindfulness for Life, which is essentially trying to write the advice I was given as if I was talking to the people I was trying to speak to directly over a drink. And so I had photographs of my daughter, very sceptical younger daughter, I have 2 daughters. I had a photograph of a whole range of different people who I thought mindfulness doesn't necessarily speak to us above my computer screen. And I wrote to those people. And that was trying, in a sense, to meet people where they are. And then as I was writing, I was sending it to those people. And my daughter would say, "Dad, that's cringeworthy, you can't possibly say that." And so on. And what I was trying to do is, in a sense, nothing novel in these ideas, but I was trying to convey them in a way that they really would reach and speak in non-mindfulness speak. I did think about not calling it mindfulness for life, but it is about mindfulness. But I think that word itself has become so laden for many people. And then the final part, the third book, which Ruth Bayer, Paul Bernard and I are just working on, I'd say about halfway through, is a teacher manual to support teachers in teaching these different curricula. So what are these curricula? One of the first things that we have tried to do in this book, which I hope is helpful, is to move away from just using the word. Okay, so a lot of people will say things like, "I tried mindfulness, doesn't work for me." Mindfulness, muesli. Isn't that muesli and hair shirts? No, that's not my kind of thing. Oh, I saw that. That's when you go on a retreat. So we, in a way, try, depending on the context, who you're talking to, try and use language that really can speak to people and meet people where they are. And one of the ways in which we define mindfulness and think about mindfulness is with this idea of befriending. And the metaphor we use is, who's your best lifelong friend? Who in your life would you describe as a lifelong friend that you really value in your life? And what qualities do they have? And people will say things like, they're supportive, we can have fun, they have my back, they're constant. If something tough is happening, they'll call me out. If I do something well, they'll say, "Good job, great work." And then we'll suggest to people that your body and your mind are kind of the friend you're going to have the longest in your life. What kind of relationship do you have to your body and mind? Is this a relationship that's worth investing in? Because if you think about your lifelong friends or a sibling you get on well with, you phone them up even if you don't feel like it. And if they do something irritating, kind of irritates you, you go, "Well, I love you as a friend, and I can, that's part of it. I'm sure I irritate you too." So can we change this sense of how we relate to our body and mind? And I think that's quite unusual for people to think about it. And it also removes the gym metaphor. If I go like this, three sets of 12 reps with increasing intensity, I'm going to have the most amazing, as my daughter would say, guns. But of course we don't do that, right? And my guns aren't that impressive or all that amazing. But I do invest in my friendships. And it's that changed relationship to the body and mind. And that piece about values. And that piece about awareness. And when people say, "No, I tried mindfulness and it didn't work for me," really? I don't mean that I would obviously never say that to someone, but that idea of befriending your body and mind, bringing awareness to your life. Having a sense of what's important to you and actually aligning your life with that. Very few people will say, "No, I tried that, it doesn't work for me." Some people do, I'm sure, but so these are some of the qualities, and I want to just move on and make sure I cover some of the most important stuff. Ruth was talking about this in her talk as well, which is, I think in mindfulness we have we're offering people a compass of their values, and we're offering them a map of how they can get from A to B, a life well lived if you like. But we're also offering what Ruth was talking about, which is this sense of supporting people's capacity and supporting people having a greater sense of capacity through learning new skills, through having new experiences, through having a sense that actually, if difficult things happen to me, or even beautiful things happen to me, I am resourced to be fully present in this moment and to navigate my way through this moment. Does that make sense? So, one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is the idea of transitions. How many of us really stop and wake up and use transitions in our life as an opportunity to really connect with our values and move through them with awareness? And by this I mean, starting school, adolescence, first serious relationship, first heartbreak, leaving school, getting into a long-term relationship, leaving a long-term relationship, retiring, having a terminal diagnosis, last few weeks and months of life. How many of us really are able in those transitions to just reset, come back to? And I think, how much is that part of the mainstream of our lives? How much is that part of schools and how we educate children in schools? So that's in a way what we're trying to do with this curriculum, and what we're trying to support people to do is to bring awareness, imbued with these sort of befriending the mind, imbued with this sense of compass, so that they can see their lives in these two profoundly important ways, with their thinking mind, but also their experiential, the wisdom of their body, the wisdom of their experience, as Ian McGilchrist could talk about it. So, in those moments, with the tiny moments of the day, but also the bigger moments of the day, people can learn to respond skillfully. So, I want to just bring this to life a little bit. So, and then we'll have some time for just some questions. So, I worked in, one of the things I was thinking about was how do you communicate these ideas to audiences I might not normally communicate to. So I worked with a filmmaker called Tyson Joseph, and he said, I've worked with him before. He's fantastic. He's this extraordinarily inspiring man. He's also been involved with the Grenfell, making films around the Grenfell Towers fire disaster. And he said, I've read your book, and I'm about to become the father of 2 twin daughters, and this is really helpful to me. Can I help you make some films? And I said, sure, Tyson, but I can't quite imagine what that would look like. And he said, well, look, just trust me, and I move in a different world to yours, and let's see if I can make some films that will speak to this world. And when I watch these, I feel slightly cringy, so I apologise if you might have the same reaction, but other people, who are the people I'm trying to reach, have told me they don't find them cringy, so.
Chapter 11. Just as a plant requires unique care, so do the many facets of our well-being, like a morning ritual or time spent with loved ones. Discover what nourishes you. In this chapter, we'll spend the time to know exactly what it is that you need to equip yourself for life's journey. Find your essence for a life well lived, living well. Chapter 11.
I think that's 40 seconds long. I think the chapter is like 40 pages long. And so what Tyson's done is he's taken some quite complex ideas and got them into 40 seconds. And he's got the spirit in there. And what he said he's trying to do is, I think you can communicate a lot with these little films. And the reason I think they're really valuable is they can just awaken interest in groups of people that we might not be used to speaking to. And I think that's one of the things that we as a mindfulness community need to be thinking about. How do we do that? How do we awaken interest in people that we might not be? And my daughter, I have 2 daughters, but I love them both equally. Honestly, I do. But the one I keep mentioning is actually helping me with my social media work, because she's a professional footballer, and female professional footballers do not make very much money, so I'm supporting her in her dream, and she's supporting me with social media. She says, these films are brilliant, love these, just the right length, maybe a little bit too long, can I cut all the dead space out? And I want to just give you, I'll come back to this in a moment. No, I'll do that in a second, actually. So one of the things that we've been doing, as colleagues of mine have been doing, is thinking about, if you think about how can you introduce mindfulness to people at a population level, and then how do you take them on a journey, those who want to go on a journey from being introduced to these ideas to going deeper and going further and really integrating it into their lives. And so I don't know the answer from a research point of view about the opening of the funnel, but my very strong sense from the data is if we want to introduce mindfulness, and by mindfulness I mean a sense of alignment with values, I mean an ability to pay attention, an ability to self-regulate, compassion, these qualities of befriending the mind at scale, my hunch is that's going to be through changing the culture and the climate of organisations. And by organisations I mean schools, prisons, families, but also homes, and also the ecosystem of social media, and the ecosystem of the entertainment industry. I don't game, but as part of my research for the book, I learned quite a lot about gaming. There's quite a lot of games that are actually quite good at this, about changing particularly young men's sense of community, because they're gaming with each other. And then some of them have got a real sort of values piece to them. You actually move to different levels when you demonstrate positive values. Some of them are shooters. You shoot more people, you kill more people, you go up. But there are different ways in which you can do things at the opening of the funnel. Beyond that, we've then introduced this idea of very brief introductory modules. How can you introduce mindfulness in a way that really catches people without it being too intensive? These are just sort of 3 one-hour sessions, which we call Introduction to Mindfulness. Then, as you go deeper into the course, you start to think about the 8-week course, which we all know. But there's lots of people who have finished that course who say, that was fantastic, actually quite transformative. And I feel like you're just pushing me off the edge of a cliff now. What do I do next? So we've developed a curriculum which we've called Taking It Further. And I want to come and drag me off the stage in a second. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish with giving voice to this woman. But just before I do that, I am a proper scientist. You have to just trust me. So we have now done, I was going to present this in a minute, but we have done, I think, 3 randomized controlled trials. Well, I know 3 randomized controlled trials, which are beginning to sort of provide really clear evidence. This is with healthcare professionals and with school teachers, that we can take people from wellness or from languishing into wellness. And those who are well when they start this curriculum, particularly the Taking It Further curriculum, we can move them from wellness actually into thriving. And I think that's really interesting and important. The other thing we've demonstrated, which I think is really important, this is actually with Mark Williams and Danny Penman's book, is, and this is kind of a no-brainer, but we've done some research to suggest this is the case, you give people a really brief intervention, it's going to be really accessible. People can say, yeah, I can fit that in. But then don't expect amazing effects. Give people a more deep intervention, they're going to say, oh, no way can I cram that, get that into my life. But if they do, you can see some really transformative effects. So that kind of supports this idea of the funnel of, let's give people some brief stuff and reach lots of people. But if you really want, for those people who want more transformative change, that involves an investment of stuff over time. I'm going to give the final word. There's these 4 characters in the book that I fell in love with because I was developing them over 6 years. I'm going to just give the final word to Sophia. This is actually based on a real example that a colleague of mine, Maggie Farrow, former head teacher, told me, now a grandmother.
When infants and toddlers encounter something for the first time, they bring to it a sense of awe and wonder, what's sometimes called beginner's mind. Beginner's mind means recapturing that sense of seeing things as if for the first time.
One weekend I was taking care of my grandson Noah. I had bought some fresh strawberries at the market earlier in the day because I knew Noah had recently started to eat solid foods. It was time to introduce him to strawberries, so I handed him one in his high chair. He squashed it in his hands with delight at its softness, and the way as he crushed it, it changed into mush. Then he put his hands and the strawberry mush into his mouth. His eyes lit up and his whole face creased with the sweetness of the strawberry, first on his lips and then when he realized he really liked it in his mouth. In that moment, he looked like he'd discovered something amazing, which he had, the feel and taste of a fresh strawberry. I gave him a second strawberry and had an idea. It was just the two of us, and I thought, to hell with it, no one's watching. I'm going to eat this strawberry exactly like Noah, mirroring what he does, move by move. Oh my, we both enjoyed the feel, smell, and taste of the fresh strawberries, and we laughed, belly laughed. It was messy. Oh, I couldn't get away with that in a restaurant, but it was fun. Noah has beginner's mind because he is an infant who has never tasted a strawberry.
Sophia is bringing beginner's mind.
So this is an actor, and for the audible version of the book, they've employed these actors. And I wanted to just end on that note because this is about mindfulness being completely integrated into life in really playful and really everyday ways. And actually, Sophia in this character is a mindfulness teacher. But she's not trying to teach her grandson mindfulness. She's in a way embodying this quality. Actually, one way around, she's learning something from her grandson. People talk about that, right? Like children or grandchildren, like bodies atlas. So she's learning something from that and feeding it back. And I think one of the ways I'd like to end this talk today is this kind of sense of one of the things that we as a mindfulness community need to do is just sort of re-envisage how can we meet people where they are with this sort of spirit of diversity and inclusion, and how can we actually support people on a journey from first introducing mindfulness all the way through to this sort of more transformative and long-term journey. And can we do that in a way that we're underpinning everything that we do with the very best available kind of research and science. And I'm sorry I've gone over a tiny bit, Christoph. Yeah. Okay. Do we have time for any questions, or are we over? They've only just finished upstairs, just in fairness to me.
Thank you, Willem. If people can go to the heart of your question ASAP, that would be great. So if you have any questions, now is a good time. Or comments, yes. They have too many questions.
We're all having the same hallucination. Amazing. Seeing as nobody else has got a question, I'll ask mine. So I work in a health board, and so the reason that we're not delivering mainly is because of the lack of support in supporting mindfulness teachers with all the requirements. So whichever level of intervention, then it's that lack of background, foundational support.
So I think that's really, really important. If we're realistic about implementation, we need to think through all of the complexities of implementation. We need to keep focused. We need to keep working on that. And making all of the arguments.
I will just say the latest trial had a sort of cost-effectiveness analysis of, this is the trial comparing usual care with MST for people who hadn't responded in IAPT. And the cost-effectiveness analysis were just extraordinary. I mean, because if you think about CBT, if it's done nice recommended at 16 to 20 sessions, you compare that with an 8-week class with 15 to 20 people in a class, it's just extraordinary. But that, as a manager, you still have to deal with the issue of how do we get these people trained, how do we get them the support they need, how do we get them the time that we need. So I do understand that. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Willem. Willem is too kind, humble, and modest for big introductions, which is why that didn't happen. I would like you to think that I was being rude. It was agreed that way, but I do hope, Willem, that you can accept our deepest heartfelt thanks for your time and your presence today.